The island of Taiwan, known historically as Formosa, was under colonial Dutch rule from 1624 to 1662. In the context of the Age of Discovery, the Dutch East India Company established its presence on Taiwan to trade with China and Japan, and also to interdict Portuguese and Spanish trade and colonial activities in East Asia. The time of Dutch rule saw economic development in Taiwan, including both large-scale hunting of deer and the cultivation of rice and sugar by imported labor from Fujian in China. The Dutch also attempted to convert the Aboriginal inhabitants to Christianity, and suppress aspects of traditional culture that they found disagreeable, such as head-hunting, forced abortion and public nakedness. The Dutch were not universally welcomed, and uprisings by both Aborigines and recent Han Chinese arrivals were quelled by the Dutch military on more than one occasion. The colonial period was brought to an end by the 1661 invasion of Koxinga's army after 37 years. History. Background. At the beginning of the 17th century, the forces of Catholic Spain and Portugal were in opposition to those of the Netherlands and England, both mainly Protestant, often resulting in open warfare in Europe and in the possessions in Asia. The Dutch first attempted to trade with China in 1601 but were rebuffed by the Chinese authorities, who were already engaged in trade with the Portuguese at Macau from 1535. In a 1604 expedition from Batavia, Admiral van Warwick set out to attack Macau, but his force was waylaid by a typhoon, driving them to the Pescadores, a group of islands 30 miles west of Formosa. Once there, the admiral attempted to negotiate trade terms with the Chinese on the mainland, but was asked to pay an exorbitant fee for the privilege of an interview. Surrounded by a vastly superior Chinese fleet, he left without achieving any of his aims. The Dutch East India Company tried to use military force to make China open up a port in Fujian to trade and demanded that China expel the Portuguese, whom the Dutch were fighting in the Dutch-Portuguese War, from Macau. The Dutch raided Chinese shipping after 1618 and took junks hostage in an unsuccessful attempt to get China to meet their demands. In 1622, after another unsuccessful Dutch attack on Macau, the fleet sailed to the Pescadores, this time intentionally, and proceeded to set up a base there at Makung. They built a fort there with forced labor recruited from the local Chinese population. Their oversight was reportedly so severe and rations so short that 1,300 of the 1,500 Chinese enslaved died in the process of construction. The same year a ship named the Golden Lion was wrecked at Lamy just off the southwest coast of Formosa. The survivors were slaughtered by the native inhabitants. The following year, 1623, Dutch traders in search of an Asian base first arrived on the island, intending to use the island as a station for Dutch commerce with Japan and the coastal areas of China. The Dutch demanded that China open up ports in Fujian to Dutch trade. China refused, warning the Dutch that the Pescadores were Chinese territory. The Chinese governor of Fujian, Shang Josuo, demanded that the Dutch withdraw from the Pescadores to Formosa, where the Chinese would permit them to engage in trade. This led to a war between the Dutch and China between 1622 to 1624, which ended with the Chinese being successful in making the Dutch abandon the Pescadores and withdraw to Formosa. The Dutch threatened that China would face Dutch raids on Chinese ports and shipping unless the Chinese allowed trading on the Pescadores, and that China not trade with Manila, but only with the Dutch in Batavia and Siam and Cambodia. However, the Dutch found out that, unlike tiny Southeast Asian kingdoms, China could not be bullied or intimidated by them. After Shang ordered them to withdraw to Formosa on September 19, 1622, the Dutch raided Amoy on October and November. The Dutch intended to induce the Chinese to trade by force or from fear, by raiding Fujian and Chinese shipping from the Pescadores. Long artillery batteries were erected at Amoy in March 1622 by Colonel Lee Kung Hwa as a defense against the Dutch. On the Dutch attempt in 1623 to force China to open up a port, 5 Dutch ships were sent to Luau and the mission ended in failure for the Dutch, with a number of Dutch sailors taken prisoner and one of their ships lost. In response to the Dutch using captured Chinese for forced labor and strengthening their garrison in the Pescadores with 5 more ships in addition to the 6 already there, the new governor of Fukien, Nanjuyi, was permitted by China to begin preparations to attack the Dutch forces in July 1623. A Dutch raid was defeated by the Chinese at Amoy on October 1623, with the Chinese taking the Dutch commander Christian Franks prisoner and burning one of the 4 Dutch ships. The Chinese began an offensive in February 1624 with warships and troops against the Dutch in the Pescadores with the intent of executing them. The Chinese offensive reached the Dutch fort on July 30, 1624, with 5,000 Chinese troops and 40 to 50 warships under General Wang Mengzhong surrounding the fort commanded by Martin Sonck, and the Dutch were forced to sue for peace on August 3 and folded before the Chinese demands, withdrawing from the Pescadores to Formosa. The Dutch admitted that their attempt at military force to coerce China into trading with them had failed with their defeat in the Pescadores. At the Chinese victory celebrations over the red-haired barbarians, as the Dutch were called by the Chinese, Nanjuyi paraded 12 Dutch soldiers who were captured before the emperor in Beijing. The Dutch were astonished that their violence did not intimidate the Chinese and at the subsequent Chinese attack on the fort in the Pescadores, since they thought him as timid and a faint-hearted troop based on their experience with them in Southeast Asia. Early years on deciding to set up in Taiwan and in common with standard practice at the time, the Dutch built a defensive fort to act as a base of operations. This was built on the sandy peninsula of Taiwan. This temporary fort was replaced 4 years later by the more substantial Fort Zeelandia. Growing control. Pacification of the Aborigines. The first order of business was to punish villages that had violently opposed the Dutch and unite the Aborigines in allegiance with the Dutch East India Company. The first punitive expedition was against the villages of Bacloan and Matau, north of Sakam near Taiwan. The Matau campaign was easier than expected, and the tribes submitted after having their village razed by fire. The campaign also served as a threat to other villages from Tirosan to Longkirau, while the pacification campaign continued in Formosa, at sea. Relations with the Chinese were strained by the Dutch attempts to tax ships in the Taiwan Strait. War eventually broke out between the Ming and the Dutch, and the Chinese Admiral Zheng Keelung defeated the Dutch at the Battle of Liaoluo Bay in 1633. Some Dutch missionaries were killed by Aboriginals whom they had tried to convert. The catechist, Daniel Hendrik X, whose name has been often mentioned, accompanied this expedition to the south, as his great knowledge of the Formosa language and his familiar intercourse with the natives rendered his services very valuable. On reaching the island of Pangsui, he ventured, perhaps with overweening confidence in himself, too far away from the others, and was suddenly surrounded by a great number of armed natives, who, after killing him, carried away in triumph his head, arms, legs, and other members, even his entrails, leaving the mutilated trunk behind. Pax Hollandica and the ousting of the Spanish. Following the pacification campaigns of 1635 to 1636, more and more villagers came to the Dutch to swear allegiance, sometimes out of fear of Dutch military action, and sometimes for the benefits which Dutch protection could bring. These villages stretched from Longkirau in the south. By some commentators, one area not under their control was the north of the island, which from 1626 had been under Spanish sway, with their 2 settlements at Tamsui and Keelung. The fortification at Keelung was abandoned because the Spanish lacked the resources to maintain it. but Fort Santo Domingo in Tamsui was seen as a major obstacle to Dutch ambitions on the island and the region in general. In 1642, the Dutch sent an expedition of soldiers and Aboriginal warriors in ships to Tamsui, managing to dislodge the small Spanish contingent from their fortress and drive them from the island. Following this victory, the Dutch set about bringing the northern villages under their banner in a similar way to the pacification campaign carried out in the previous decade in the south. Growing Chinese presence in the Guo Y Rebellion, the Dutch began to encourage large-scale Chinese immigration to the island, mainly from Fujian. Most of the immigrants were young single males who were discouraged from staying on the island, often referred to by Han as the Gate of Hell for its reputation in taking the lives of sailors and explorers. After one uprising by Han Chinese in 1640, the Guo Y Rebellion in 1652 saw an organized insurrection against the Dutch, fueled by anger over punitive taxes and corrupt officials. The Dutch again put down the revolt hard, with fully 25% of those participating in the rebellion being killed over a period of a couple of weeks. Aboriginal rebellions in other areas of Taiwan. Multiple Aboriginal villages rebelled against the Dutch in the 1650s due to oppression, like when the Dutch ordered Aboriginal women for sex, deer pelts, and rice be given to them from Aborigines in the Taipei Basin in Wulawan village, which sparked a rebellion in December 1652 at the same time as the Chinese Rebellion. 2 Dutch translators were beheaded by the Wulawan Aborigines, and in a subsequent fight 30 Aboriginals and another 2 Dutch people died. After an embargo of salt and iron on Wulawan, the Aboriginals were forced to sue for peace on February 1653. Siege of Zealandia and the end of Dutch government on Formosa in 1661. A naval fleet of 200 ships, led by the Ming loyalist Koxinga, landed at Lac Gemise with the intention of ousting the Dutch from Zealandia and making the island a base for Ming loyalists. Following a 9-month siege, Koxinga captured Zealandia. Koxinga then forced the local representatives of the Dutch East India Company to sign a peace treaty at Zealandia on February 1, 1662, and leave the island. From then on, the island became Koxinga's base for the Kingdom of Tungning. Coda. The Dutch retake Keelung after being ousted from Taiwan. The Dutch allied with the new Qing dynasty in China against the Zheng regime in Taiwan. Following some skirmishes, the Dutch retook the northern fortress at Keelung in 1664. Zheng Jing sent troops to dislodge the Dutch, but they were unsuccessful. The Dutch held out at Keelung until 1668, when Aborigine resistance and the lack of progress in retaking any other parts of the island persuaded the colonial authorities to abandon this final stronghold and withdraw from Taiwan altogether. Government. The Dutch claimed the entirety of the island, but because of the inaccessibility of the central mountain range, the extent of their control was limited to the plains on the west coast, plus isolated pockets on the east coast. This territory was acquired from 1624 to 1642, with most of the villages being required to swear allegiance to the Dutch and then largely being left to govern themselves. The manner of acknowledging Dutch lordship was to bring a small native plant planted in earth from that particular town to the governor, signifying the granting of the land to the Dutch. The governor would then award the village leader a robe and a staff as symbols of office and a prince and flag to display in their village. Governor of Formosa. The governor of Formosa was the head of government, appointed by the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies in Batavia. The governor of Formosa was empowered to legislate, collect taxes, wage war and declare peace on behalf of the Dutch East India Company and therefore by extension the Dutch state. He was assisted in his duties by the Council of Taiyuan, a group made up of the various worthies in residence in Taiyuan. The president of this council was the second in command to the governor, and would take over his duties if the governor died or was incapacitated. The governor's residence was in Fort Zeelandia on Taiwan. There were a total of 12 governors during the Dutch colonial era. Economy. The Taiwan factory was to become the second most profitable factory in the whole of the Dutch East Indies, although it took 22 years for the colony to first return a profit. Benefiting from triangular trade between themselves, the Chinese and the Japanese, plus exploiting the natural resources of Formosa, the Dutch were able to turn the malarial subtropical bay into a lucrative asset. A cash economy was introduced, and the period also saw the first serious attempts in the island's history to develop it economically. Trade. The original intention of setting up Fort Zeelandia at Taiwan in southern Formosa was to provide a base for trading with China and Japan, as well as interfering with Portuguese and Spanish trade in the region. Goods traded included silks from China and silver from Japan, among many other things. After establishing their fortress, the Dutch realized the potential of the vast herds of the native Formosan sika deer roaming the western plains of the island. The tough deer skins were highly prized by the Japanese, who used them to make samurai armor. Other parts of the deer were sold to Chinese traders for meat and medical use. The Dutch paid Aborigines for the deer brought to them and tried to manage the deer stocks to keep up with demand. Unfortunately, the deer the Aborigines had relied on for their livelihoods began to disappear, forcing the Aborigines to adopt new means of survival. However, the subspecies was kept alive in captivity, and subsequent reintroduction of the subspecies into the wild has been successful. Later, the Dutch also traded in the agricultural produce of the island after large-scale cultivation was implemented by the colonists utilizing imported labor from Fujian. Agriculture. The Dutch also employed Chinese to farm sugarcane and rice for export. Some of this rice and sugar was exported as far as the markets of Persia. Attempts to persuade Aboriginal tribesmen to give up hunting and adopt a sedentary farming lifestyle were unsuccessful because, for them, farming had two major drawbacks. First, according to the traditional sexual division of labor, it was women's work. Second, it was labor-intensive drudgery. The Dutch therefore imported labor from China, and the era was the first to see mass Chinese immigration to the island, with one commentator estimating that 50–60,000 Chinese settled in Taiwan during the 37 years of Dutch rule. These settlers were encouraged with free transportation to the island, often on Dutch ships, and tools, oxen and seed to start farming. In return, the Dutch took a tenth of agricultural production as a tax. Head tax. A head tax was levied on all Chinese residents over the age of 6. This tax was considered particularly burdensome by the Chinese as there had been no taxation prior to Dutch occupation of the island. Coupled with restrictive land tenancy policies and extortion by Dutch soldiers, the tax provided grounds for the major insurrections of 1640 and 1652.